This presentation is to give you some ideas on how theories can be understood, what elements to look at while reviewing a theory, to start thinking about research and apply in research studies. Blue Book's author Moore and Kearsley explain what theory is and why it is important in an approachable manner in their book. They said everything that is recorded in the literature of a field makes up the theory of the field. So the summary of literature in that particular field are found useful by more and more scholars and researchers, and they become authoritative. It often becomes theory. It is like a map. A map summarizes what is known about a place. And if there are any empty spaces, it shows them. That is the clue to knowing where new exploration, that is research, is needed. The accepted facts and concepts that make up theory also provide a shared perspective for those who have studied it, as well as a common vocabulary for discussing, analyzing, or criticizing it. So knowing the theory is very valuable for everyone who wants to participate in distance education. For researchers, it is indispensable. Moore and Kearsley also listed a few important names in the history of distance education in terms of theory development and research. These people are important because they provided seminar work that guided many scholars, researchers, and educators, and their work still remain critical when you attempt to find an origin of recent ideas in distance education. The names include Ravel, Delling, Graf, Doman, Peters, of course Michael Moore, and Keegan as well. There are many more you will be able to find across this module as well as this course. So I hope you get familiar with these names, especially when you're reading different chapters and articles that is provided and you find during your own search. In particular, Moore and Kearsley also introduced more in depth about Otto Peters, a German scholar who actually wrote his work Distance Teaching and Industrial Production, a Comparative Interpretation in Outline in 1967. Peters' work is important in that a lot of and most of his ideas still remains and sort of like transition to what we actually view distance education at our age right now, even after 60, 70 years after he actually had his article out. For him, distance study is a form of study complementary to our industrial and technological age. And this completely makes more sense because you have learned the history of distance education, how it actually began. And while we're actually moving into very advanced technological ages, distance education has become the one mode that might actually expand what we do in the classrooms and even further what we do in the classrooms. The techniques that he actually mentioned about that translates from the industrial settings to this education are the systematic planning, specialization of the workforce, mass production of materials, automation, standardization and quality control, the need of actually quality control, and full range of modern communications technologies. All these are the characteristics that Otto Peters actually talked about in the early ages of distance education, and I believe this still is the same in this era that we're living in 21st century. I'm hoping that you can remember a few names here, especially Otto Peters or Michael Moore, Desmond Keegan, and try to find more articles from them to understand the origins of the distance education as well as how it evolved to what it is right now. Now, giving out some examples of theory related to distance education and how that might be actually connected to research in distance education as well as practice of distance education. Self-directed learning, SDL, is a process in which individuals take the initiative without the help of others in planning, carrying out, and evaluating their own learning experiences. So in essence, SDL, the self-directed learning, is an informal process that primarily takes place outside the classroom. What qualifies learning as self-directed is who, the learner, makes decision about content, methods, resources, assessment and evaluation of the learning. Now, do you see some potential research question here? Do you see yourself as a teacher or an instructor making such decisions or giving your students certain guidelines or power to do so in your own classroom? On what ground? Is this only research questions I'm throwing out, or is it also a practical question you can throw out when you are a teacher in a distance education setting or even in a face-to-face classroom? In self-directed learning, individuals take responsibilities for their own learning process by determining their needs, setting goals, identifying resources, implementing a plan to meet their goals, and evaluating the outcomes. So, what process do learners go through to identify their needs or set a goal or identify a resource or implement a plan? How do they come up with a plan, first of all, and evaluate their own outcomes? The benefit of SDL is that learning can easily be incorporated into daily routines and occur both at the learner's convenience and according to his or her learning preferences. It can involve the learner in isolated activities such as research information on the internet. It also can involve the learner in communication with experts and peers, as in a traditional classroom. Then you might want to throw out another question here. How do all these processes occur? You can see that I'm keep throwing questions while attempting to understand the theory. And that's the starting point of a research study. And not to mention that these questions definitely could actually occur during your process because you're in the classroom with learners and you're trying to think about how much power, how much ownership do I actually give my students? 0 power, 0 ownership to full maximum 100% ownership to my students. How do I shift it? How much? What's the best way to do it, in which, with what type of students and which kind of content and which type of subject areas. Self-directed learning can be difficult for adults with low-level literacy skills who may lack independence, confidence, internal motivation, or resources. Okay, so I ask questions again. How important the trait of independence in succeeding in distance education? What is the relationship between self-directed learning and student self-efficacy? Brookfield in 1985 suggested that not all learners prefer the self-directed option, and many adults who engage in self-directed learning also engage in more formal educational programs, very traditional teacher-directed courses. This argument is made in 1985. Is it still the same in 2020 or 2021 and beyond? With the adult education setting, the teacher can augment traditional classroom instruction with a variety of techniques to foster self-directed learning for individuals or for a small group of learners who are ready and willing to embark on independent self-directed learning experience. What are those techniques, by the way? And which ones are better than others or more suitable than others in a particular context? Here's another research question for you. Self-direction is a critical component of persistence in an adult education, helping learners recognize how and when to engage in self-study when they find they must step out of formal education. Okay, now, is self-directed learning only applicable for adult learners? How about children or adolescents? Or even like young adults in the first year or second year of college. Can you see where I'm heading it with understanding this theory, but keep asking questions related to the theory, but it also related to the practice that you do in any kind of classroom or teaching and learning settings and contexts? Now, here's another example of the theory of transactional distance. Transaction means connotes the interplay among the environment, the individuals, and the patterns of behavior in a situation. This explains that distance education is the interplay between people who are teachers and learners in environment that have the special characteristic of being separated from one another. This explains the core idea of the theory of transactional distance, that distance is not simply a matter of geographic distance, but it is a pedagogical phenomenon that affecting that geographic separation has on teaching and learning, especially on interaction between teachers and learners, on the design of the courses, and on the organization of human and technological resources. These all should be taken into account very seriously. So, looking at the theory of transactional distance, some research ideas can be thrown out to you is studying the organizational forms or teaching behaviors according to the time and space distance. How much transactional distance we or our students will tolerate in terms of teaching behaviors. They are all about like dialogues and structure. How should they be designed and pursued? As the first variable of transactional distance, dialogue is at the center. Holmberg actually said distance education implies that the character of good distance education resembles that of a guided conversation aimed at learning, and that presents of the typical traits of a conversation facilitates learning. Holmberg's core idea is that the learner-teacher dialogue is the fundamental characteristic of distance education, and the feelings of these personal relations between the teaching and learning, entities kind of promote study pleasure or student motivation. Looking at this concept of guided conversation or dialogue has been considerable research on the social and language-based nature of this teaching and learning relationship. It has been casting further light on the importance of this concept as well. So this brings us back to Vygotsky's theory of learning, which, if you remember, that explains the centrality of language as a medium by which the student, the learner, constructs a way of thinking. So social constructivism, if you remember this term, through the exchanges of meanings and the development of a shared understanding, learners gradually come to take control of the process of learning, and they enter a community of shared discourses as novice learners, novice professionals, with the support from an experienced instructor. This area is certainly an attractive line for research. The second set of variables that define transactional distance are elements in the course design, that is structure. A course consists of elements such as learning objective, content, themes, information presentations, case study, illustrations, exercises, assignments, project tests, everything. Quality depends on how carefully all these elements are composed and structured. When designing, you don't just throw out different components without order, which means sequence, or a scope. Do you throw out everything that you want your students to learn, or you have to think about the time, you have to think about the amount of work they need to do. You come up with the best ways to help students meet standardized criteria of achievement. What determines structure of distance education? First off, educational philosophy of the teaching organization, teachers themselves, or academic level of the learners, the nature of the content, and by the communication media to be employed. Which one's more important, or how should they be sort of like working together to bring out the maximize and optimize learning experiences? The extent of dialogue and the degree of structure varies from courses to courses, from programs to programs. In a course or a program with little transactional distance, learners receive directions and guidance through ongoing dialogue with their instructors, and by using instructional materials that allow modification to suit their individual needs or learning styles or their personal pace. In more distance courses where there is less dialogue and more structure for learners, they have, if there is neither dialogue nor structure, then they must be entirely independent and make their own decision about the strategies. So can we actually judge on which one could be better, or in which context we have to have more structure or more dialogue, or less dialogue or less structure? Can you come up with certain answers according to your context? And why? Says who? The greater the transaction distance is, the more responsibility the learner has to exercise. The concept of learner autonomy comes into play. Similar to self-directed learning, learners have different capacity for making decisions regarding their own learning. The ability of a learner to develop a personal learning plan, the ability to find resources for study, the ability to decide for oneself when progress was satisfactory or unsatisfactory, have all been studied and being part of the theory of transactional distance. Do we have a definite answer for it? We probably don't. The degree to which the learner behaved can be seen as an important dimension for the classification of distance education. This does not mean that all students are fully autonomous or ready to be autonomous, or that all programs and teachers should treat them as such and take off their hands completely. Like dialogue and structure, learner autonomy is and should be a relative concept. How much autonomy should be given to what type of or what level of students for what type of content, in which context, and when and how? What is the role of teacher or instructor when much of less autonomy is given? These are all great research questions to start thinking of. So thus far, we've reviewed the theory of transactional distance. Transactional distance is higher or lower, which one is more effective, how are they different in terms of learning, what roles do learners play and how that affects learning, what roles do teachers play, and how that also affects learning in other questions. These are all questions that must be